Hi, this is William Henderson,
And this is B. McGraw.
and this is the Unjerked podcast. So we are doing an episode on corruption. And before we start, so our podcast is semi-affiliated with B. McGraw's website, which is
The Journal of Astrological Big Data Ecology, or JABD.com.
so we basically look at things that are discussed online on Reddit and Twitter and try to get to the root of what the truth is. So let's get started. All right. So corruption. What is corruption?
That's actually a really good question. Feels like a thing that people complain about, but how would you actually define it? Especially in the U.S. sense, because in, say, like third world countries, it's pretty obvious. Like, yeah, you can bribe a cop, you can bribe for some form to get a license to something. But corruption in the U.S. kind of seems a little bit more nebulous and quid pro quo.
Yeah, I think the thing with corruption, and when you define it, is oftentimes it kind of turns into giving examples. So you'll say, well, bribery is corruption. This is corruption, that is corruption. And that's all true, but that's not really a definition. Those are examples. And I think when I was kind of looking around online, there were a few definitions I found, but none of them were quite good enough in terms of kind of fully defining corruption. So I kind of came up with a definition that, this is the William Henderson definition, but I think it does a pretty good job. So essentially, as I define it, and I think most people would agree with this, corruption is essentially when you use some sort of position of influence within an organization to benefit yourself to the detriment of the organization or the other stakeholders of the organization. So obviously, like if you get paid a really high salary because you have a in-demand skill set, and you get paid for doing your job, that's not corruption because you're getting a salary in exchange for doing work for an organization. But I think the difference with corruption is where you do something that's kind of outside of your mandate in terms of compensation, something that doesn't really directly benefit the organization or the people that rely on the organization. So really, there's sort of an extractive element to corruption, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty decent definition.
Yeah. So what is not corruption? So high salaries, unless it's like ridiculous, like you're getting paid ridiculous consulting fees because you're, married to someone of political influence. That's one thing. But if you just get paid a ton of money because you have a high demand skill set, that's not corruption. Things that are performance or stock-based compensation, I think a lot of times that aligns your interest with that of the organization. If you go on a legitimate work trip, not just a boondoggle, I think that's not corruption. If you're motivated by careerism and you're just trying to climb up the career ladder, but you're still doing your job, that's not really corruption. So those are kind of a few things that kind of don't really fit in that category. Things that do fit. So obviously there's illegal corruption, but there's also legal corruption. And there's also public and private forms of corruption. So bribery is the most obvious example. And so the reason it's corruption is because you're essentially supposed to provide some sort of service, but you're refusing to do it unless you get extra compensation that is basically not part of your compensation package. And if you don't get the bribe, you're going to refuse to offer this service. And so, the most obvious example is in like developing countries. A lot of times the cops will demand bribes to let you go. So that's, essentially like if you did do something wrong, then their responsibility is to give you a ticket or to bring you to jail. If you didn't do something wrong, then they should just let you go. So for them to say, hey, I'll let you go if you give me money, either you're letting someone guilty go, or you're basically extracting extra money from someone who's innocent. So either way, it's kind of not aligned with your public duty as a police officer. So bribery
also that would give you a society where cops will just like charge everyone on anything they can if they need some pocket change for a burger.
Yeah, and in a lot of countries, like basically bribery is everywhere. Like basically, there's certain countries where like every time a cop pulls you over, you have to pay a bribe. Every time you go to a government office to like, renew your driver's license or whatever, you have to pay an extra bribe to kind of make sure it gets done in time. You can have places where that just becomes endemic, where you're bribing everybody. And then the next thing, another example of corruption that's illegal is embezzlement. So this is just taking funds. So if you're stealing company funds or you're stealing government funds, that's embezzlement. And it's kind of obvious why that's corruption. You're basically taking something that belongs to the organization and just putting it in your pocket. The most extreme example, there was the public in Malaysia a couple years ago. They had essentially this sort of sovereign wealth fund. And this guy who was entrusted with kind of doing business with the fund, I forgot what his exact role was, but he essentially just stole $1 billion from the fund. And he didn't even do anything sophisticated with it. He just like spent it on yacht parties and stuff. But it was called it's called like the 1MDB scandal, but that was a huge thing.
Wouldn't Sam Bankman-Fried be another good example?
Yeah, that was a pretty obvious case of embezzlement. And there's a lot of some people who read the Michael Lewis book, they were like, oh, did he know what he was doing? I mean, he was straight up taking money from customer funds and using it to buy condos. It's pretty obvious what his intent was. So there's that. And then fraud is basically some sort of deception through the course of doing business. So, creating fraudulent forms, pretending like you did some transaction that you didn't actually do, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, extortion and blackmail. So these are, a lot of people use the terms interchangeably. They're actually different things. So extortion is threatening to harm someone, perhaps physically, if they don't do something. And then blackmail is when you threaten to release harmful information about them. So a lot of people use the term blackmail for extortion, but they're technically different things. But that's also illegal. The interesting thing about corruption is that a lot of it is legal. A lot of it you are totally allowed to do. And I think a lot of the legal corruption is much more common. It's common everywhere, but you see it in developing countries as well. The most obvious example is cronyism and nepotism. This happens everywhere. Even something as small as, the coach of a middle school, t-ball team or whatever. I guess they don't do t-ball in middle school. Baseball team or softball team, might choose to put their child in the sort of varsity team or whatever. So it kind of happens in every organization, and it's really hard to stop. I think the reality, if you're in a position of privilege, you just kind of automatically have more connections and more ability to help your children. So, there are organizations that have, they have certain companies do have sort of anti-cronyism laws or anti-nepotism, not laws, but policies. So there are some companies where when you're applying for the job, they'll say like, do you have any relatives who are like directors at this company or something? And so that does happen sometimes, but like, I think this is the one form of corruption you can never really get rid of.
It's pretty tough, and even like without family, like any organization I've worked in, it always feels like there's some sort of golden boy syndrome where they just like pick somebody and say like, yep, we're going to make sure that you get all of the opportunities and awards so that you can be a future leader and move up the ranks, and then everyone else just kind of gets what they get.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's more okay if it's someone who is legitimately identified as high performing, but oftentimes that's not the case. Oftentimes it's like, oh, I like so-and-so, so I'm going to help them, Yeah. Another example, there's regulatory capture. So what this is if there's some sort of agency that exists to regulate an industry, oftentimes the industry that's being regulated ends up gaining influence over their regulator. And the reason this happens is pretty simple. So any industry, the people who are the biggest experts on that industry are people who work in that industry. So it's kind of hard to have, basically be in the position to regulate without having some sort of prior experience in the industry, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I saw some of this when I was looking up some examples of corruption on Reddit, because it's like, well, now we have all, like, that's the biggest argument people have against, like, why do we have a Congress with so many old people that don't understand how computers work, and they're about to start writing legislation on regulating AI and all these technical things. Like, they're just going to have the industry experts pull the wool over their eyes.
Yeah, I think that's, this is a bit of a tangent. I don't think Congress needs to be an expert in any specific domain outside of obviously legislating and knowing how to kind of assess, okay, who should we listen to, that type of stuff. But like Congress, members of Congress are not experts in, oil extraction. They're not experts in, chemical dyes. They're not experts in food processing, but they have to write laws about all those things. I do think if they lack even a basic level, I remember there was congressional hearings a few years ago where, they just didn't, one of them got mad at like Google for, building the iPhone or something. And it's like, okay, that's a different company.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Especially during the pandemic, I really enjoyed watching some congressional hearings, and I still do some of the good ones, because it's just like, it's pure entertainment when someone ends up saying something stupid.
Or when there's like, when a congressperson like demands a yes or no question, they ask a really loaded question and then they're like, yes or no. Yes or no. And,
so many heated moments. It's like a high stakes bar conversation, some of these congressional hearings.
Yeah. But, basically when you think about, for example, people regulating finance, what people understand finance the most? It's people who work at investment banks and people who work in, investing in private equity and stuff. They understand, interest rates, and they understand, this, that, and the other thing. In reality, I will say, like, many of the members of the Federal Reserve are like lifetime members or have spent a significant portion of their life in public service. But, the current chair of the Federal Reserve, I mean, he is a former member of the finance industry. Actually, I think this is the first time that's happened. But it is hard if you have some sort of regulatory agency. How do you have a pool of experts who are kind of ready to regulate the industry and, without having previous experience in the industry? Maybe you can have a bunch of people on retainer who are just like paid experts, but it's tough. And so what often happens is you do see a revolving door, which is something that's, there are cooling off periods, like you 2 years after you quit a job before you can kind of work on the other side of it. And then there's legal forms of bribing. So, campaign donations, I mean, that is kind of a type of bribery when you think about it. Oftentimes, so there are limits on how much you can donate directly to a campaign. I'm pretty sure companies are allowed to directly donate to campaigns. Maybe not, but I think they can. Certainly super PACs.
I'm pretty sure. Wasn't that what Citizens United is all about?
Well, Citizens United
corporations can donate to campaigns.
No, Citizens United is about donating outside of campaigns and super PACs. So before Citizens United, there was kind of like a pretty hard limit on how much you could donate, but that decision basically said it's infringement of free speech to have a limit, which is an interesting. I mean, that's what they decided. And so if you donate to a organization that is technically not attached to the campaign and which is not allowed to talk to the campaign, you can donate basically an unlimited amount of money. And I believe you don't really even have to disclose who you are. So it's quite a difficult thing to kind of untangle.
Yeah.
But, that's a type of bribery. And also, we'll talk about later, but oftentimes donors end up becoming, ambassadors and stuff. So that happens. Lobbying it includes a wide range of things, but I think some types of lobbying might kind of bleed into like, is this kind of a type of bribery? So those things exist. And I was kind of debating if this really counts as corruption, but forms of deferred compensation where essentially you're a public official, and then once you leave, you get to do a bunch of speaking fees to like companies.
I see people complain about that all the time. That gets brought up a lot.
So on the one hand, it's like, okay, maybe you just gave a talk and you're like, well, I had to fly here and do all this stuff. You should probably pay me. I'm not going to just do all, fly here, book a hotel, spend several hours of my day just for free. But on the other hand, this could definitely be construed as like, are you basically being compensated for something you did for someone, while you were in office?
It's way after you made the nice policy for whatever regulatory or whatever market. So it's like impossible to prove one way or the other.
Yeah. So, and then this last one is a bit of a stretch, but I think it still counts as a form of corruption. But basically, like if you have some sort of government worker who ended up, finding a job and they know they can't get fired and they just don't do anything for like years on end. I think that's a type of corruption, maybe a more small scale corruption, but you're essentially kind of extracting compensation without putting in the requisite labor. So
yeah, I guess that might count.
So anyways, where is corruption more common and where is it less common? So, and you mentioned in the notes, you said, well, how do you measure corruption basically? So
yeah, how many corruption units does the United States have?
Yeah, so I think the issue with basically measuring this is, there really isn't an obvious way to measure it when you really think about it. Because, like, are you going to, like, hire a bunch of people to, like, go to some country and just see, like, how many bribes they have to pay in a month? Like, it's tough to measure. And so there's an organization called Transparency International, and this is a bit, maybe this is a little too informal of a way of measurement, but they basically have something called a corruption perception index. Essentially, it's based off of opinion polls, like how, what do you think is the level of corruption that exists in this country? And so that's basically kind of the best we can do to really kind of measure how much corruption there is. So maybe not perfect, but that's what we have. And based off that research, or based off that sort of assessment, essentially the least corrupt nations are more or less the wealthiest nations. So the Nordic countries have a very, very low level of corruption, as does New Zealand. After that is Western Europe. After that is the US, Canada, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. And interestingly, Chile and Uruguay are at that same level. Yeah. And
Don't
then
we
you
keep
have
talking about Chile?
Well, they're more developed than other countries in Latin America in terms of, per capita GDP and, other measurements. And then in the middle of the pack,
they seem to keep coming up on our rankings. They're the sleeper country no one expects.
Yeah. And then in the middle of the pack, you have, Saudi Arabia, Poland, Italy, and interestingly, Malaysia. And then after that, it just, it gets lower and lower. And at the very bottom are, frankly, very impoverished countries, places in Central Asia, places in, parts of Africa, oftentimes war-torn places like Libya, Somalia, or maybe like recently, exiting some sort of some sort of conflict of some kind. Yeah. So I think there's an obvious correlation here. It seems like the wealth of a country correlates with low corruption. The question that it's tough because it's like, was that correlation or causation? Maybe corruption impedes development Or maybe the flip side is
also a easy critique that someone could make of this is the more advanced or developed the country, the more sophisticated and hard to measure the corruption is.
that's possible, but I think it's yes, there's corruption in all countries, but I think it's pretty obvious. There are certain countries where, you can't walk, you can't spend a month without, or even a week without paying bribes to people. There's countries where, the construction materials are kind of adulterated with other sort of impurities to make it cheaper. I think it's undeniable that certain countries simply have more corruption. I mean, is Denmark secretly an extremely corrupt country? Like, no, it's not. I mean, I'm sure there's things happening, but I don't think it's a corrupt country. So
I have other arguments for this too, but I just wanted to say that.
Right. So the correlation causation is difficult. Is it because less corrupt country, when you remove corruption, that promotes growth? Or is it that once you have wealth, there's less incentive to be corrupt because you already have, you're already provided for? So a few examples in the U.S. specifically. So we already talked about Citizens United. So the Brennan Center talks about Citizens United and what exactly it's about. But essentially, corporations can now spend unlimited funds on campaign advertising as long as they're not directly talking to the campaign. This is an interesting policy, but it is what it is. And another example is campaign donations, and specifically ambassadorships. So the U.S. is relatively rare among countries, and having a lot of donors basically end up being ambassadors to various countries. So Foreign Policy magazine talks about this. It says the United States is the only Western government that routinely rewards mega donors with top diplomatic posts. And there is also this donor to ambassador pipeline white paper from the CLC, the Campaign Legal Center, but basically talks about this whole concept. And typically what happens is the lifetime foreign service officers who work for the State Department end up getting, ambassadorships to, those sort of countries that are perhaps more war-torn or we have more complicated relationships with. So countries where we actually need good diplomacy is where we send the career diplomats. And then the sort of super cush ambassadorships, like ambassador to France, where your job is to basically live in Paris and go to parties. Those places usually donors get ambassadorships, or maybe not usually, but very often. In my mind, this is obviously corruption. You're basically doling out favors to people, but it's not illegal. So that's it's interesting, but it's a thing that happens. And then another case is lobbying. So there's this paper from the magazine Perspectives on Politics, I think is the name of the magazine, or not the magazine, the journal. But the article basically says, testing theories of American politics, elites, interest groups, and average citizens. And basically they look at, what drives policy in the U.S. So there's different theories. Is it majoritarian electoral democracy, or is it the economic elite's agenda, or is there majoritarian pluralism, biased pluralism? There's different interest groups, and basically they look at what research is out there. And basically their result says multivariate analysis indicates that economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on U.S. government policy, while average citizens and mass-based interest groups have little or no independent influence. So that's a pretty clear, that's pretty clear where, that lobbying actually does influence policy. And is that corruption? I think there's an argument, where you have a system where we're supposed to be one person, one vote, hypothetically, policy should broadly reflect voting patterns or people's, beliefs about what policy they want. But it seems like, lobbying, campaign donations, etc., often have a big impact as well, which perhaps is not super surprising. But
no, I mean, because, well, it always feels like something getting in through lobbying is like a small thing that ends up on some mega bill in Congress that no one reads, and maybe a few, congressional aides might catch, but like no one's going to see it. So it's just kind of like slipping stuff past the goalie. And I guess it's just like the question of like, if you're a congressman, do you have the interest of the people in your favor, or are you going to, listen to some lobbyists, but your voters aren't going to care about some little niche issue they've never heard of before.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, is like, and we should do another episode on like what actually drives voting patterns, because a lot of people have opinions on that. I do think oftentimes people, they either have like one or two pet issues they care about, or there's just general feelings they have about how they think their economic situation's doing, or some sort of group identity. I think a lot of times those things are motivating. But when you look at,
it's really interesting, I think, in America because, everyone the economy is like the biggest thing people probably vote on, like probably most years. And so everyone kind of acts like they are a stakeholder in how well the economy is doing, whether it's like their retirement accounts or having job security or whatever. Like their life's going to be better if the economy's doing better. And then they think, oh, but so-and-so says if they put this regulation in, then this industry is going to fall apart and the economy is going to do bad. Does that like honestly be a trump card for all regulatory decisions? But like it's so technical that no one really knows. Like it's all kind of magic to most people. So then it's just how people are informed, or how well people can be informed on different topics.
Well, and I think like lobbying itself I don't think is a bad thing. I think that it's kind of required to a certain extent, because you do have different interest groups when it comes to any particular issue. And you need to be able to understand that issue and talk to the people who are affected. And so I think groups should be able to have access to politicians. I think very often it tends to be more one-sided where, like for example, consumer interest groups, they really don't have a huge impact on legislation because, they're really consumer unions, maybe there's a few small ones, but it's not really a thing, bigger picture, and so I think that's where lobbying kind of starts to be problematic. All right, that's part 1 of our episode on corruption. We'll see you with part 2 next.